welcome to this week's episode of Not D&D, brought to you by EN World Live. As always, I'm your host, Jessica, and joining me this week, we have Connor Alexander from Coyote Crow Games. Connor, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
And I'm excited to ask you questions because when I first learned about Coyote Crow, I was very excited, and it looks so amazing and fantastic. And then I read through, enjoyed the game so much, and so did so many other people, because you've picked up just a couple of awards in the last couple of years. So we've had the Diana Jones Award for Excellence in Gaming, the Crit Awards, Tabletop Awards. I'm sure there's more I'm missing, because I think your trophy cabinet is so full now. So the first thing I want to say is congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That was not planned by any means, but I'm thrilled to be acknowledged.
Fantastic. Well, so obviously the main thing we are going to be talking about is Coyote and Crow this episode. But before we talk about the game, I would like to talk a little bit about you and get to know you.
Sure.
So your history with role-playing games, what's the first role-playing game that you can remember playing?
It was absolutely D&D, right? It was
classic.
Classic basic edition D&D in the late 70s, early 80s. But it was really rapidly that I don't want to say maybe tired of that is not the best way to put it, but I grew beyond D&D pretty rapidly. And of course, my other selections that were available were the other things that TSR was putting out, things like Gamma World and Boot Hill and all of those early sort of D&D spinoffs. But by the time the late 80s rolled around, I was playing things like riffs from Palladium. Early 90s, I was playing Cyberpunk 2020 and Vampire the Masquerade. So really quickly, I love the fantasy genre, but I'm more of a sci-fi guy. So for me, D&D was just the quick gateway drug into all of these other games that I wanted to play.
I think that's the case for a lot of people as well. So I think, you start off with D&D because it's the most known thing. And then you're like, okay, this is storytelling games can be a whole thing. And so you go out and explore that. That's really interesting to see that you have like a range of different systems that you know and loved and played. And I think that shows in the kind of the game design. So we'll come back to talking about the system a little bit later as well. But you... talking about your background with games, you're obviously somebody that played a lot of games and enjoyed games, and then in 2014 you joined the hobby game industry. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what your career history has been like working in hobby games? Because a lot of people listening and watching perhaps have aspirations to do that themselves.
Yeah, so I was not ever. I never had my sights set on working in the game industry. I was happy as just a player. And a consumer. My degrees in film and television. I worked in the film industry for a long time, and then later in marketing. And then I live in Seattle, and there was a sort of a economy bust out here in around 2012, and I got laid off. And a friend of mine knew a game shop that was opening up, and they needed employees. And I took the job really out of desperation. I wasn't really interested in going back to retail after years of being a waiter and working in service industry. I didn't want to go back to that. I felt like I had grown beyond doing that. And but then I found myself working there and absolutely loving it, and being the manager, ended up being the manager there, and really finding a new perspective on the game industry and where it had come from. I'm old enough that a lot of my game history was spent around a table at home with my friends, and being in this environment where I was seeing much more organized play efforts and more growth in the hobby in a way that I never really experienced. Things like Friday Night Magic, Magic the Gathering, or groups of people playing Dungeons and Dragons or other RPGs at the game store. It completely reinvigorated my love for the hobby industry, the hobby gaming industry. And a couple of years later, I was recruited to work for a distributor called PSI that sort of works behind the scenes. And that gave me, again, a whole new vantage point, seeing things from a publisher perspective and really getting to learn the industry in and outs and how this whole industry works, all the little cogs behind the curtain, as it were. And that just inspired me even further. And then I started to realize that maybe I had something to contribute, that I wasn't just going to be an office worker, have a day job in the game industry, that my creativity, which normally had come through me as an outlet for either writing for regular fiction or for through screenplays in my film and television work, that maybe I had something else to offer the game industry.
Fantastic. Well, I think that segues us really nicely into talking about Coyote and Crow then. So I think it's so interesting that you talk about your background being in film as well and screenwriting, because there's a couple of game designers and publishers that have come on that have had that background. And I do think that role-playing games are just another way of telling stories. You're kind of, because if you work in film and TV, you'll think it's a way of telling a story and communicating a message. And role-playing games, you're trying to give people the tools to do that themselves at their own home table. So absolutely. I think that's interesting. I'm noticing a common theme with people I interview, so I wanted to pick up on that. But let's talk about Coyote and Crow, because that's why I asked you here. So if people haven't heard of Coyote and Crow before, how would you like to introduce it to them?
I like to describe it as a science fantasy RPG. So a little bit of science fiction, a little bit of fantasy, that is set in an alternate history where colonization of the Americas never happened. And players play as people who are indigenous to the Americas, set in a futuristic fantasy setting that has a whole range of elements to choose from, whether it's mythological and indigenous cultural related elements, or some more classic sci-fi elements, advanced technology and things like that. So I think it's a really unique mix out there right now. I don't think there's a whole lot else to compare it to. I've heard both native folks and non-native folks describe it as some sort of like a mix of Wakanda from Black Panther meets Horizon Zero Dawn, the video game. So
those are two excellent reference points, because two amazing pieces of media. So that's okay. That's fantastic to hear. So that's a great pitch for it, by the way, as well. I think you can tell you've done this marketing route a few times, but. Thinking about the game, how did you come up with the concept for this? So you said you were working more in kind of the logistics, fulfillment, retail side of the games industry, and then you were like, maybe this is something I could create. How did this idea be born?
Yeah, so it was born out of two sort of core conceits. One was that I was not seeing good or any representation really in the game industry for Native Americans. There were a number of games out there that weren't. Occasionally they were rubber stamped at the end of their creation by Native consultants as being not offensive, but not offensive is not the same as either accurate or inclusive or good. My frustration sort of boiled over, and I was at a point where I felt like I had the time and the resources and the background to sort of put my money where my mouth was and contribute something to that discussion. The other end of that, though, was that all of the games that I was seeing out in the industry continually put the spotlight on Native Americans in a way that they were always dealing with colonialism in some form or another, whether it was a Western or a Revolutionary War, whatever it was, we were always in context as a reaction to colonialism. And frankly, for a lot of natives, that's traumatic. Like, we continually are having to re-engage with our own traumas. And I really wanted to do a setting that didn't have to deal with colonialism. And originally, my first thought actually was to do something, pre-Columbus, pre-colonial contact. But the problem with that is that non-natives already have a view of natives as something from the past. And I knew if this game was going to be successful, it had to speak to more than just native audiences. It had to speak to both crowds. And so I just decided to crank the thing in completely the opposite direction and set it in the future. And I was like, how often do even natives, do we get to think about ourselves in a futuristic context? We're so often trapped in these positions where we have to deal with our own current day-to-day tragedies. And so I thought, why not give natives, especially native players, something optimistic to play in, something that's hopeful and imaginative.
Fantastic. I think it's a fantastic idea, because, like you say, it hits all that for the native audience. But also, even if you're not native, it's a new and different story. Like you say, this story is not out there, so it's something new to explore. And as people who love games and who love stories, are we not always wanting to create kind of new stories and explore new ideas?
Absolutely.
So I think it works for everybody. So let's dive more into the setting of the game. So it starts very interestingly, like, you know, and on the Kickstarter page, it talks about like 700 years ago, an event happened and the alternative history. So could you bring us into the setting and tell us the story?
Yeah. So where our histories diverge, our real world histories diverge from what happens in Coyote Crow, is about 700 years ago. A climate disaster happens, and it's never specified, you know, to exactly what it was. But the general idea is that people believe maybe a comet or a meteor hit somewhere else on the Earth, and it completely altered the climate. So much so that the Americas were put into a deep ice age. And this forced a lot of trauma and change to all of these cultures that were existing in around the year 1400. And that's sort of where the histories diverge. And so the other thing that happens is within a few hundred years, people begin noticing this purple mark on themselves, on other animals, on plant life. Basically, all biological life has this little sort of purple mark. And it's in the game, it's called the Adenati, which is a Cherokee word for the gift. And this sort of becomes this is sort of where the fantasy element comes in. So fast forward a few hundred years, and the planet is slowly beginning to heal itself. People have struggled to survive, but that struggle has sort of advanced technology and cultures. Things have shifted from what we might have viewed that original, 1400 era history. And science has come far enough that people have learned to sort of harness this Adenati, this purple mark, in a way that can give them fantastical abilities. And I wouldn't call it so far as to describe as like superhero level abilities. No one is flying around and shooting lasers out of their eyes or anything like that. But it does give players the option to have abilities that might be slightly more than what we real humans have, and just give them sort of a heroic edge. And yeah, so that's sort of the basis. Where I think the game really shines is its incorporation of the spiritual with the technological. And sort of at the point where you're coming into this game, it's maybe about 100 years from our real future. And the Earth is finally healing, and the player characters are sort of jumping into this world that is really about to experience a huge growth spurt, for better or worse, because now the planet is more explorable, and treaties that used to keep governments in line, the reasons for those treaties are sort of falling apart. And so you have all of these nation states now that are poised to potentially clash with each other. And so your characters are coming into this world that is both I guess from a certain perspective secure. Like everybody in Cahokia, in the main town you start in, has all of their basic needs met, but there's this burgeoning sort of gloom on the horizon as characters start to realize that the politics and the technology is about to really go explosive and potentially change everything.
Absolutely. I think it's key to highlight that it's not a dystopian setting at all, but it's also not a utopia. It's a living, breathing world that exists, and it has, like you say, problems and politics and opportunities and potential threats. So it's a living world to step into.
Absolutely.
Creating the world, you had a fantastic team creating this game.
Yeah.
Could you talk about how you selected the team and all the different people you had in for, the art, the writing, the development, all those different parts?
Yeah. So the writing team was somebody I brought on. They were folks I brought on board fairly early in my process. I had the basic structure of sort of the alternate timeline built out, the basic mechanics. But as I started to fill this world out and I wanted to make it feel lived in and breathable, I realized that just my own perspective as a Cherokee wasn't going to be enough. So I got folks like Coyote Old Bear and Derek Pounds William McKay, a whole bunch of other folks, basically, who had a broad array of not only real world indigenous experience and heritage, but completely different skill sets from me. We brought in an actual chef to write our chapter on food and restaurants, an indigenous chef who has experience in pre-Columbian foods. Derek Pounds is from Samish Nation, so he has a bunch of experience in the Pacific Northwest and cultures, their culture up here. And so we just brought in a wide variety of voices to help flesh out what this world might look like. I can never thank William McKay enough, who did our work on our fictional in-game language, Chahi. I'm a deep believer that for every RPG, one of the first things I dive in to look at when I'm looking at a new RPG is how do they treat language? How do they treat art and music? And how do they treat food? Because I feel like those are like cultural foundations. So for any fictional setting, how do you treat those three things? And so for me, it was really important that we got all three of those right. Also because they're important to real world indigenous cultures here in North America. And I wanted to capture that importance in this setting. So those writers really helped me flesh it out. Coyote is amazing. And she's a Comanche woman who has never had any RPG experience, but a ton of writing experience. And she brought in a lot of her ideas and imagination to a lot of the sort of subcultures that are listed in the freelance portion of the book, which is a sort of the middle of modern America, is sort of this great open space with all of these different microcultures. And she wrote a lot of that material, and it's some of my favorite stuff in the book.
Fantastic. And with the artwork, I want to talk about the art a little bit. Well, we will talk about the game system in a bit, because I just love the world and the creation. The artwork in the book, I feel, really creates the mood and the environment for the setting. I've got some of the pictures here just from the Kickstarter page. So this was the very beginning of my looking at it, which is why I want to share them here.
So it was really important for me to get the art right. I wanted as many native artists on board as I could get, but B, there had to be a sense of infusion of indigenous concepts with futurism, because there isn't a lot of that out there. And I think I struggled with that, honestly. That was probably the toughest challenge in the entire book, was finding artists who had not only that skill set, but the ability to envision that. As a first-time art director, my biggest challenge was fighting with my artists and going, no, you're still not thinking futuristic enough. I had that conversation a lot with my artists, because we, I think as Native Americans, are so entrenched with preserving the past. It's one of our strengths, that I think that we try to preserve our culture, but our eyes are so focused on that sometimes it's hard to get artists to shift to a futuristic perspective. So I struggled with that, and I'm really happy that I've had such a good response with it in the end. But finding artists who had that skill set and who wanted to work in an RPG setting, you're talking about a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche, right? So it's a very select group of folks that can do that. But I'm so grateful, because now I have this great crew of artists who, some of them, moved on and haven't worked with me again, or I didn't want to work with them again. We didn't communicate or whatever. But there's a good group of folks from this core book that moved on and worked with me on Stories of the Freelance, our first set of adventures. Now I feel like I have this wonderful crew of artists to work with continuously.
Fantastic. Well, it's great when you have a group of people like that you can work in for new projects. So I think it makes an RPG set almost have its own, kind of visual brand and style that carries through all the books. So that's awesome to see. Let's dig into the system now. So the game has a unique system, dice pool based. There's loads of things I kind of want to talk about. How should we best start talking about it? How do you want to introduce what the game system is?
So the game system is a pool system, dice pool system, very much inspired by anybody who has any history or experience with RPGs. They're going to immediately notice the similarities to White Wolf's World of Darkness system, vampire system.
That was the first role-playing game I ever played, so I'm
Oh,
familiar
wow.
with it. Yeah.
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 So you immediately probably spotted the similarities there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I think the reason I chose that is one, I'm older, right? So I think a lot of my history going back to those things, those moments where I was really inspired by RPGs are from some of the games from that era. And I think for me, at the core of it, Vampire was the first game that I played that made me realize that RPGs didn't have to just be about stats and minis on a board and measuring out distances. To me, absolutely the most boring aspect of Dungeons and Dragons was trying to measure out ranges and area of effect. I am not a math person.
Yeah, yeah,
I've
yeah.
never been a math person, and that it
Mhm.
just does not interest me. I was always more
Mhm.
interested in narrative, and
Sure.
Vampire really did that well.
Mhm.
And so when it came to creating my game, I had a lot of early conversations with folks who were supportive of me in the industry and talking about newer ways to approach storytelling game systems. You look at games like Fiasco or Powered by the Apocalypse, games that are much, or the Fate system, games that are
Sure.
very much geared toward low dice, high narrative value.
Mhm.
And I was tempted by those. I really was tempted by those. But there's
Mhm.
also a component to Coyote and Crow that I really wanted for the game, which was that I wanted it to be a little crunchy. I wanted it to
Mhm.
feel a little bit like those 90s and 80s RPGs. Um,
Mhm.
part of that is a personal preference, but the other part of
Mhm.
it too is that I think there's a slight prejudice in the indie game scene where, well, maybe prejudice isn't the right word. Um, there's a phenomenon I've seen in the indie RPG scene where you have the hardcore folks who like love RPGs and they'll pick up a 2-page RPG, right, and dive into it and absolutely love the hell out of it. And then you
Mhm.
have these other folks who, unless it's on a glossy 300-page hardbound book at a major game store sitting next to D&D, they ignore it. And
Mhm.
I didn't want my one swing at bat, because I had to realize that like this game, I didn't know it was going to be successful at the time, but I thought this might be my one swing at bat for an RPG. And I said, if
Mhm.
I'm going to do this, I want to create a physical game that could sit next to D&D on the shelf at a game store. And so for that, I felt like I had to create a whole
Mhm.
vibe around that, whether
Yeah.
it wasn't just the page count, it was the size of the book, it was the spot UV, it was the
Mhm.
all of the dice pool mechanics that made it feel like an epic game to sit down and play. And I think some of those folks that are into the smaller RPGs, they're great,
Mhm.
but you don't get that feeling of epicness maybe that you do when you crack open a 400-page book. So
Mhm.
yeah.
So that was the idea behind making the system.
Yeah,
So
that was the core conceit there. Yes, absolutely.
I want a big book in a game store that's sitting on the shelf that yeah, and that is now, and that's where it is. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
mission achieved. So talking a bit more kind of about the rules, I want
Yeah.
to talk kind of about the characters and how that works. So as you mentioned, it's a dice pool system. You have
Yeah.
stats that are based around like strength, intelligence, and
Mhm.
spirit. One thing that really interested me was your progression in the game. So you don't kind of level up like you would in D&D if people are
Yeah.
familiar with that. Could you talk about the legends system and your
Yeah.
design choices around that?
Yeah. Thanks for calling that out, by the way, because that's kind of my baby in the game.
Oh yeah.
For me, yeah, it really is. I mean, a lot of the other stuff, the dice pool system is great, and for some
Hmm.
people that they're going to love it. Some I get,
I
but some
love a
people.
dice pool. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. Some
Yeah.
people jam in it, other people it's not. And I
Hmm.
totally get that that's a preference thing. When it comes to the
Hmm.
legend system, I was never a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, especially when the era that I grew up in it with it.
Hmm.
It was always, an experience point was equivalent to a gold piece, and that is
Sure. Yeah.
it's such an incredibly colonial mindset. And
Hmm.
so, because what I wanted for these characters in this game was to create this sense of, your stories, your characters' stories are going to be told around a fire 7 generations from now. I wanted the characters to have this epic feel to them. And so rather than creating an experience system or a progression system where you were growing as a character by either killing something or stealing something or acquiring personal possessions, I wanted to create a system that reflected sort of narrative arc progression. So your character progresses as stories are completed. And so in the game, you do have or there's skill progression. There is stat progression. Those are what we call short-term goals in the game. Your character can progress in a skill. And that's very low tech. But the actual legendaries levels in the game are more about completing narrative arcs as a group. And not only does your fame grow as your legends grow, but the thing I love the best is that when you reach the end of that narrative arc, every player is expected to create a short narrative about what they did to get to that level, what sort of stories they went through, and they always are supposed to write them as though they're the primary hero in their story. And it can be a paragraph, it could be a poem, it could be song lyrics, anything they like. But then the idea is that when you all get back together as a group and you share these stories, they're all going to be slightly different because you're all perceiving the events of your adventures slightly differently. You're going to remember specific different key moments from those stories. And I love the idea of collaborative storytelling and then coming back and seeing who remembers what and how do they remember it. And that, to me, that system speaks more to true heroic growth to me than just a bump in strength, you know? Again, number crunching is boring for me. That's the least important part of it. Some of one of the things I get pushback on. So we have a system in the game called gifts and burdens. I think if I remember right, there's a similar one in Vampire. It's flaws and gifts, or flaws and
yes, yeah. If you're playing like a supernaturally type one,
yeah. So it's a similar concept where your character is either has things that help sort of boost them or draw them back that are external to their character, whether it's allies or friends and family or, you know, other factors, right? So with gifts and burdens in my game, though, you have to take on a burden every time you go up a legendary level. And I got a lot of pushback from players on that. They're like, why are you punishing your players for going up a legendary level? And I said, think about a hero's journey. They never defeat a villain without acquiring some new next hurdle. Maybe it's guilt for having killed the villain, or maybe it's the son of the villain wants to come back for revenge and now they have a new arch nemesis. But there's always a new problem on the horizon. And if you just simply eliminate a problem and then that's a clean cut, that's not really how life works. And it's certainly not how epic hero journeys work. Heroes are always faced with new dilemmas. So I decided to build that in right away.
I love that. It stood out for me as a really fun system. It's interesting that you say about burdens, though, that people feel that they were kind of punished by them. Because for me, it felt more like more of a opportunity to grow your character and have some sort of interesting narrative thing to them. Could you give some examples of burdens people have used and, you know, mechanically what impact that has?
Yeah. So I think the example we use in the book is like having a little sister. And you can anybody can have a little sister, and maybe it's not a gift or a burden. You could put that in your background. Something is only a gift or a burden when it rises to the level of a mechanical effect. And so the one I use in the example in the book is having a sister. She might be a gift because maybe she's an engineer and she's going to help you build that hovercraft or repair that hovercraft that you really want. And so she's going to bring her skill set in. But maybe she's a burden, and maybe she's 13 and annoying as hell and always demanding your attention and always getting in trouble. And maybe she's both. Maybe she's a 13-year-old engineer who's a pain in your ass, but it's going to help you build that hovercraft. So we have quite a few in the book. I try to list them out as suggestions. part of my character creation building suggestion is that everybody do it at a session -1, even a pre-session 0. Sit down and collaboratively create your characters, because unlike a lot of other RPGs, Coyote Crow encourages family and connections. Characters are rarely sort of mercenaries meeting in a pub. I mean, you can do that if you want. Certainly, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. But just as often, I've seen characters create whole groups, or players rather, create whole groups of characters who are all family members. There's brothers, sisters, cousins all working together. And it's good to establish those relationships when you're creating your characters. And so when it comes to gifts and burdens, you can have things like allies and opponents, addictions, wealth, things that affect your wealth. Either you're poorer or richer than average. So there's a whole array of things to build into your character. And I find those work best if you're talking about them with the other players, because especially if you end up being, a brother and sister character, well, maybe you should both take that wealth burden then, or that wealth gift.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense
properly. Yeah, so I think that's those gifts and burdens in the game. We did list out a number of them. I think there's maybe 10 in there. But we don't limit anybody. Somebody can come up with their own completely, we have one in there called quirks, and I threw in quirks because, and I have to thank my my sensitivity reader in there for this one, because we had a number of ones that were a little more specific, and some of them went into like mental health issues, and I was like, she called me out on it. She's like, you're going to get in trouble for this. Like, this is the way you worded it isn't necessarily offensive, but I think you're putting labels onto something where you didn't need to. And if you just throw it in there as quirks, people can choose to define it how they want. And that's really what I wanted from the gift and burden system, is to let people decide whether something is a gift or a burden to their character. There's no objective value to these things.
Fantastic. You mentioned kind of a pre-session 0 and session 0 there. For people that are planning to run this game or play it for the first time, what sort of guidance do you have? The guidance for people's session 0s or pre-session 0s? How would you say it's best for someone leading the game to prepare for that?
Yeah, so I would say when you get your group together, the first thing you want to decide is what sort of stories do you want to be telling. Unlike a lot of RPGs, like Vampire's a great example of this, right? You're playing vampires. You're probably going to be playing in a specific town, in a specific set of a specific time frame. That's very guided, right? Like you have a sense of what that story is going to be about. But with Coyote and Crow, you could literally do, urban high-tech noir fantasy, or like high-tech noir sci-fi, or you could do a Dungeons and Dragons style exploration into the wilderness, where you're going into the great unknown and you don't see anybody for months at a time. There's such a huge array of possibilities that you don't want your players to feel ambushed. So my first suggestion would always be to decide on the tone and the setting and the location for your adventures in this game. The second thing I would say that's really important is figure out at your table if anybody is native and if anybody is bringing in their specific native heritage, because that's an option in this game if you want to bring your real world heritage into the game. And if not, if no one at the table is native, then talk about what you're not going to be doing at the table, how you're not going to have anybody bringing in headdresses for cosplay moments, any of the really obvious stuff that would be offensive and bringing in crappy stereotypes. But I think most of those, I think people who are picking up Coyote Crow to play it, most of those folks are going in with a good heart, and they're not going to be doing those.
Yeah.
We call it out, but
yeah, I mean, as for me, so I'm white British and I have this accent, so I'm very much stereotypically the colonizer role. But what I really appreciated was that you do in the book give guidance for non-native players on how to enjoy the game in a respectful way. Because I know I looked at the book and I was like, this looks great. I want to play the game, but I know I'm going to be playing a native character, and I felt a bit apprehensive about that because I was like, oh, I don't think I know enough to do that in a good way. So I really appreciated that guidance that you gave, and how you said, hey, no, this game is for everyone. You don't have to be native. And you kind of gave that guidance. So that was really appreciated, because that. yeah,
it really boils down to what I think is true for any game, which is play them like a human being, right? I think there's a lot of games out there. There's a lot more in like the Afrofuturist genre right now that are going on. I think it applies there too. The games are for everybody, and just go in and play them as human beings and strip the stereotypes out.
Absolutely. I think that's almost a great kind of note to wrap up and end on, unless, is there anything else about the game or the system that you'd like to kind of shout out or talk about? Any questions that I didn't ask you that you'd love to talk about?
I don't know. You covered a lot. I think you've got it.
I think we got it. Okay, great. Well, I do have another question for you, though. It's not about your game, because we spent a little bit of time talking about Coyote and Crow. Oh, actually, I will say, if people are interested and they want to pick up a copy, where's the best place for them to go to get a copy of the book?
I always answer for that one, your local game store. I'm a big supporter of local game stores. So if that's a possibility, if you have the option of going to a local game store, please do. After that, I would say go to my website, coyoteandcrow.net. We have a web store there. We only ship to US and Canada through that website, unless you're buying digital products. However, we do have international distribution. So even if you're in the UK or elsewhere, you should be able to find our book at game stores. Also, we're on Amazon as well. So if Amazon is your go-to, you can find me there.
Fabulous. And my last question, which is it's not about where you can pick it up, was, do you have any recommendations for any TTRPGs that you particularly like or that you're enjoying at the moment? And the rules are, it can't be a game that you've made and it can't be D&D for the obvious reasons.
Yeah. So there are a couple, and I can actually pull up the boxes here.
Fantastic. We love that. Visual aids as well. So if you're watching the stream, you can see them there.
Alice is Missing, not a traditional TTRPG, but I'm going to call it one. I love Alice is Missing.
For the podcast, they're scrolling through currently a bookshelf full of many different tomes. Yes.
I've got quite a few back here. Collateral Damage. This is a little indie one that a friend of mine made. I don't know if you know Daniel, but have you heard of Collateral Damage before?
I haven't. And this is also why I ask guests for recommendations, because these are people I invite on the next shows.
So really briefly, Collateral Damage is a game about playing in a movie. So you decide a movie genre you're going to play in beforehand, but you are not the main heroes in the story. You are the background extras. And the important thing is for you to have the most entertaining and exciting death at some point in the movie as the person who gets blown up in an explosion or stabbed in the back or whatever your horrible fate is. So there's a lot of humor in the game. It's a lot of fun. And it's always just a single session at a time. And I love this game.
That sounds great.
I love that you probably know, everybody knows this one, but it's one that I'm hoping to write for one day. And that is Free League's Alien, the Alien game.
Yes.
I love it. I love it. I love the cinematic aspect to that game. And it's one that I really, really want to write for one day.
Oh, that is a good pick. If anyone watching is curious about the Alien game, we have had them on as a previous guest, so you can go and listen to that episode if you want to find out more about that game and the system and why we're both quite excited about it. But that leads us to the conclusion. Connor, thank you so much for coming on and giving up your time to talk to me. I know you're very busy with many different projects going on. If people want to catch up with new projects you're doing, where's the best place to find you online?
Coyoteandcrow.net has our news. We also have a sign up for a newsletter there. But we're at Coyote and Crow Games on most social media. We also have a fantastic Discord. If you're interested in learning more and talking with good people about Coyote and Crow, there's a link to our Discord on the main page of our website at coyoteandcrow.net. And you can go there and the people on our Discord are just lovely folks, full of very helpful native folks.
Amazing. That sounds great. And if you're listening to the podcast, we'll put the link to the Discord in the show notes, so you can just click through there. That brings us all. Thank you very much, Connor, for giving it your time and coming to talk to us. Thank you for everybody who came to watch or to listen. We'll be back when you are watching this. We'll be coming into October. So our October guests will have a slightly horror or spooky theme to these games coming up. But that's all for this week. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.